do you remember like when it kind of clicked for you where you were like, okay, so this is like an application that I will be able to use with some of my patients that is going to be potentially groundbreaking for them and maybe a lot of other people?
Yeah, well, so my story after I saw a couple patients is I visited doctors who were using it to try to figure out what to study. I was convinced this is worth studying. And so our method is based on Dr. Atkins, Dr. Eads, Dr. Rosedale, Dr. Bernstein. It's a lot of clinical doctors at the time. And it was, I was trained in clinical trials and was part of smoking cessation clinical trials for about 8 years before I did this. So I kind of knew that it took 2 or 3 studies to know that you had, randomization, so people didn't know what diet they were getting, and after a while you get the idea that yes, this is safe. There's no, no one's dropping over. Like you have to remember, 20 years ago, people were afraid they would die the next day, when they stopped eating carbs, right? I mean, so there was the fear was heightened at the time. So, it took me, 3 or 4 studies where, we're not, we scrutinize the data pretty carefully and then publish them. So it's not just here in my experience. We did the due diligence to get through the peer review process and publish them in medical journals. And it was after doing 2 or 3 of those studies that I sort of remembered that I had visited these other doctors and they had years and years of experience. But at first, it's like I didn't let that count. I wanted to come to it with an open mind, but skeptical. And so like most researchers, you're not going to say that it's okay until you study it. And that's where we are now, that all these other researchers just haven't studied it, so they don't comment on it. Or at least the ones who are open-minded are kind of agnostic or neutral now. They say, well, it has a role. They don't know that what's best, or they don't, at least they don't say that it's bad anymore. And that there are a certain number of researchers who read other people's research. Not many do, but those who read other people's research at least say, okay, there's a lot of data behind it. And that's why I think the kind of green light was given 2 or 3, 4 years ago for products and this popularization in the last few years, which is great to see, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely, the when it kind of clicked in my head as like, oh, this is more than just like a little bit of a fringe movement that's going to blow away anytime soon, was probably after I'd been doing it for a few years. I first started my low carb stuff back in, I think it was late 2011. So it was like right before we started seeing a lot of products show up in the store that were related to keto or low carb. Now you go in and there's actually decent marketing around it. To comparatively speaking, I should say, there's obviously a lot of marketing again for the cheap carb based food products as well. But like I'll go into a grocery store now and you'll see like keto friendly signs on products. Well, just products that are specifically marketed towards folks following a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. And to me, when I first started seeing that, I was thinking to myself like, oh, okay, so the corporate world is betting on this sticking around more than just a year or two. So I was like, okay, it must not be just me having some success with this if I'm seeing that. But it is interesting to think that like sometimes that stuff doesn't necessarily always line up with like how soon someone like yourself maybe gets interested in it.
Well, yeah, it's a problem if you're ahead of the curve in terms of business. Now, in research, usually that's where you want to be, right. But the research money for low carb and keto has just been non-existent. And it echoes Michelle's experience that the mainstream folks, there's still this fear, there's a fear of studying it, which is just kind of crazy. It's just food,
and from the dietitian, and this is the frustration. This is the dietitian's dilemma. This is, as a dietitian, I was taught that the way to treat diabetes is that we're going to give somebody a consistent carbohydrate diet, and then we're going to dose them with insulin. And so what I mean by that is, every meal you're going to get 75, 90 grams of carbohydrates, and then we'll dose you with, an amount of insulin to keep your blood sugar stable. And even as a young dietitian, I asked, like, well, that doesn't seem to make sense. If their blood sugar is already high, why would we be giving them carbohydrates? Which, it doesn't matter what carbohydrates it is. It doesn't matter if it's apples or Snickers bars. That is still going to raise your blood sugar, specifically if you're diabetic. Why don't we pull the carbohydrates back? And and if you're in acute care, which most dietitians, I worked in acute care, you're really not there for their long-term problem. Like, most of the time, if they're in the hospital, they might be there for an amputation or an infection. So the diabetes is just kind of a secondary thing. Like, I was told, like, look, we're not even talking about that. If they want to go deal with that, they can, go to an outpatient dietitian. But then, unfortunately, you're going to get that same, poor education. So there really is this unwillingness to look at other alternatives, and as we talk about in the book, the Academy of Nutrition is heavily sponsored by PepsiCo, Frito-Lay, the company that makes a lot of those sugary boost drinks. And there's this kind of the dogma is the best way to treat diabetes is to have carbohydrates consistently throughout the day. And as I say in the book, I have an analogy. It's kind of like setting your house on fire consistently. Like, if you're consistently setting your house on fire, if you have diabetes, eating carbohydrates is like throwing flames on your house. And then using insulin is like putting those flames out. It's like, why not set your house on fire? And unfortunately, like you said, there's just this fear and this misunderstanding. I mean, if you Google a healthy diet, it's going to tell you to eat fruits and vegetables. It's going to divide carbohydrates into the good carbohydrates, the fruits and grains, and then the bad carbohydrates, the sugar. But they all are basically broken down the same way, and certainly we could get into the nuances of how fructose is metabolized by the liver. But just in general, when you come back to the fact that out of the 3 macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrates are the only macronutrient that our body does not need. That's not essential. Yet you will die without protein. You will die without fat. We're seeing now that people are thriving without carbohydrates. I was shocked to see research. I have patients in acute care. I had one guy that lost both of his legs, amputated, and part of his hand. And we can actually reverse diabetes in as little as 8 days on a low-carb diet. That blows my mind. If we can reverse it within less than 2 weeks, why are people suffering for 20 years? Why is the dietetics community not taking a stand and saying, you know what, this isn't working? And just like you said, Zach, I'm not a moralist. I'm not somebody who thinks there's only one way to fix everything. But I think we have to provide this information. We have to say, hey, this is your option. You can follow a high carb diet. We will dose you with insulin. And in 20 years, we'll probably have to cut your leg off. Or you can try this other option. I'm being a little bit frank, maybe overly frank. But after seeing so many very, very painful things, I talk about, I've seen wounds down to the bone, pressure ulcers. I've seen people as young as their 40s that have had strokes, blindness, incontinence. It's a big problem. And it's something that has, in my opinion, a relatively simple solution.